On a cold, silent night in the mountains, Gabriel was fast asleep in his tent. The starry sky outside contrasted with the sultry warmth of their small nylon retreat. The flames of the campfire, which he had carefully kept burning until sleep overcame him, were now only sparse embers, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding rocky landscape. Suddenly, a distinct sound broke through the serenity of the night. Gabriel opened his eyes slowly, his heart still heavy with sleep. The noise seemed to come from outside the tent, a subtle but insistent noise, like the scratching of dry branches against the fabric. He raised his head and for a moment held his breath, listening intently. The sound persisted, and he wondered what it could be. It must just be a small animal, he thought to himself, trying to dispel the slight discomfort that was beginning to grow in his chest. Life in the mountains was filled with such encounters, with squirrels, rabbits, and other nocturnal creatures often roaming the camps in search of food. He closed his eyes again, adjusting his body in the sleeping bag, trying to regain lost comfort. Despite his effort to ignore the sound, Gabriel's mind continued to churn. Fragments of thoughts and memories mingled with the darkness around him, but he forced himself to focus on the stillness that followed the noise. "Tomorrow will be a long day of walking," he muttered softly, as if trying to convince himself that sleep was the best choice. Little by little, fatigue overcame worry, and Gabriel sank back into sleep. The tent filled with the slow and steady rhythm of his breathing, while outside, the night continued its course. Gabriel was drifting back into sleep when a shrill sound abruptly awakened him. The tent fabric tore with a dry, aggressive noise, and he opened his eyes in a start. A huge, dark figure invaded the small space illuminated only by the pale light of the moon. The strong, wild smell filled the air, and in an instant of sheer terror, he realized the gravity of the situation. It was a bear. Gabriel's heart skipped a beat. Every fiber of his being instinctively screamed for survival. His fingers trembled as he reached for the pocket knife he kept nearby for emergencies. The blade was small, a fragile hope against the mass of muscles and claws that now rose before him. The bear, with eyes shining with a primal hunger, roared, a sound that reverberated through the valley and Gabriel's own chest. Before he could react, the bear attacked. The sharp claws tore the fabric of the tent and hit Gabriel with brutal force. The pain exploded in his shoulder, a blow that threw him backwards against the stacked backpacks. The penknife escaped his fingers, falling somewhere out of reach. Trying to get up, Gabriel was hit again, this time in the ribs, the impact crushing his hope of any defense. The tent, now a tangle of fabric and torn zippers, was a chaotic battlefield. The bear, driven by an uncontrollable impulse, attacked fiercely, while Gabriel, his vision blurred by pain and fear, tried futilely to protect himself. Their cries of agony echoed through the night, but no help would come. The bear, satisfied with his helpless prey, momentarily retreated. Gabriel, bloodied and almost unconscious, felt the warmth of blood mixed with the cold of the mountainous night. His thoughts were a confused mixture of regret and hopelessness. The shadows around him seemed to close in, and the last thing he saw was the dark figure of the bear retreating into the darkness, leaving behind only the distant sound of its triumphant roar. The excruciating pain and terror of the attack were beginning to give way to exhaustion, and the adrenaline that had kept Gabriel conscious until then was finally beginning to drain away. His body, bruised and bleeding, showed clear signs of collapse. Every breath was a tortuous effort, and the weight of the night seemed to compress him against the ground, while the shattered tent around him became a scene of silent destruction. The cold of the mountain, once kept at bay by the heat of struggle and fear, now penetrated his bones. Gabriel felt weaker and weaker, his vision beginning to blur as blood spread around him, soaking the fabric of his sleeping bag and the cold earth. His thoughts, once agitated and chaotic, now became slow and hazy. He tried to move his hand to stop one of the deeper wounds, but the force no longer responded. The air around seemed to vibrate with an overwhelming stillness, and every distant sound of the forest seemed to echo in an endless void. His eyes, heavy with pain and fatigue, began to close involuntarily. Gabriel knew, somewhere in the haze of his consciousness, that he was fainting. The fight against the darkness was futile, and his body demanded surrender. He let out one last breath, a sound that was at once one of pain and resignation, before being swallowed by unconsciousness. His body rolled on its side, his eyes closing completely, and he fainted, delivered to the fate that the night had in store for him. The outside world faded away, leaving only the silent and cold vastness of the mountains that enveloped it. Gabriel was in his city apartment, a clear, sunny morning illuminating the compact Moderna space. The apartment was filled with boxes of camping gear he hadn't used in months. A new tent, a sleeping bag, portable cooking utensils, and a sturdy backpack. He checked each item carefully, an animated smile plastered on his face. Finally, "I'm going camping again," Gabriel said aloud, excited. He talked to himself, a habit he had maintained since childhood. "I need that time in nature." While adjusting the tent ropes, the phone rang. He picked up the device and saw that it was his friend, Lucas. "Hey, Lucas," Gabriel answered, the animation clear in his voice. "Come on, Gabriel. Ready for the big adventure?" Lucas asked on the other end of the line. "More than ever. I haven't been out camping in a while. I'm missing the mountains," Gabriel replied, as he carefully folded an emergency blanket and put it in his backpack. "I understand well. You deserve this time to relax. Are you going alone this time?" Lucas asked, the subtle concern in his voice. "Yes, I need some time of my own. The city has been too stressful lately. I need to reconnect with nature," Gabriel explained, as he adjusted the water canteen on the side of his backpack. Lucas laughed lightly. "Enjoy it, but be careful. You know how unpredictable nature can be." "Absolutely, Lucas. I'll take every precaution. I've already checked my first aid kit 3 times, Gabriel joked, but there was a tone of seriousness in his voice. "That's good to hear. Have fun and send news when you can," Lucas said. Ending the call, Gabriel hung up the phone and took a deep breath, feeling even more excited for the journey. He spent the next few minutes organizing the rest of his belongings, making sure everything was in perfect condition. "Okay, it's all here," he said, closing his backpack with a decisive zipper. He took his favorite cap and put it on his head, adjusting it. With his backpack firmly strapped to his shoulders, Gabriel left the apartment, descending the steps with a leap in his step. The city was waking up, but his mind was already in the mountains. He got into his car, feeling the excitement build as he started and headed out of town toward the freedom of the mountains. The winding road was a reminder that nature was waiting for you. Gabriel could feel the wind on his face and the smell of the trees, eager to rediscover the tranquility and peace that only camping could provide. Gabriel drove down the winding road with the music low and the window open, feeling the fresh mountain air invade the car. The view was stunning, with snow-capped peaks in the distance and green trees along the way. He was excited, full of expectations about the camping weekend he had been looking forward to for so long. Upon arriving at the park, however, noticed something strange. The main entrance was blocked by a barrier, and 2 vigilantes were standing next to it, talking to each other. Gabriel parked the car and got out, approaching the men. "Good morning," Gabriel said, trying to sound optimistic. "I'm here to camp. I haven't been here in a while, and I'm really looking forward to spending time in the mountains." The watchers looked at each other before one of them, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache, answered. "Sorry, sir, but the park is closed at the moment." Gabriel frowned, disappointment evident on his face. "Closed? Why?" "I checked the site before coming and did not see any information about the closure." The other watcher, a young man with a worried look, explained, "We are in the mating season of bears, and they are more aggressive and territorial than usual. For the safety of visitors, we had to close the park temporarily." "I understand the concern, but I really need this time in nature," Gabriel insisted, trying to argue. "I have taken all the precautions. I am well prepared. I can follow the safest trails and keep my distance from the animals." The older vigilante shook his head slowly. "We are sorry, sir, but we cannot make exceptions. We've had incidents in this season before, and it's just too risky. Everyone's safety is our priority." Gabriel sighed deeply, feeling the frustration grow. He looked around, seeing the majestic mountain landscape that was so close, but at the same time, unattainable. "Are you sure there is no area of the park that is safe for camping? Not even a small one?" The watchers exchanged glances again before answering. "I'm sorry, but we can't allow anyone into the park right now," said the young vigilante, in a firm but sympathetic tone. "Maybe you can try another location, outside the bear's catchment area." "Thank you," Gabriel murmured, feeling defeated. He slowly walked away, returning to the car. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, pondering what to do next. The mountains, which had seemed so welcoming, now seemed distant and hostile. As he prepared to start the car, he decided he wouldn't let it ruin his weekend. Gabriel sat for a moment in the car, looking at the closed entrance to the park and at the vigilantes talking among themselves. Determined not to let it ruin his plans, an idea occurred to him. He remembered a remote area on the other side of the park, a place he had visited years ago. It was deserted and rarely patrolled. If he could get there, maybe he could get in without being seen. "If they won't let me in from the front, I'll go through the woods," he muttered to himself, starting the car again and driving down a lesser-known road, skirting the park. With a new purpose, Gabriel started the car and began to drive, going around the perimeter of the park. The road was narrow and winding, but he knew the way well. While driving, his mind was fixed on the goal of finding a quiet place to camp, away from any interference. After about an hour, he came to a dirt road that led to a lesser-known area of the park. Gabriel parked the car in a hidden spot and grabbed his backpack, adjusting it on his shoulders with determination. "I'm not going to let you stop me from enjoying this weekend," he muttered to himself as he began walking down the narrow trail that led into the park. The silence of the forest around him was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional song of a bird and the rustle of leaves under his feet. He walked carefully, making sure not to make too much noise, keeping an eye out for any signs of danger. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, but it was a mixture of excitement and caution. "I'm not going to let anyone ruin my camp," he said, tightening his backpack straps around his shoulders and starting to walk down the trail. As I made my way through the dense forest, I felt a mixture of adrenaline and euphoria. Each step he took brought him closer to his longed-for adventure. The trail was uneven and required care, but Gabriel was determined. The sound of the city gradually disappeared, replaced by the rustle of trees and the distant singing of birds. After about an hour of walking, he came to a small clearing that vaguely reminded him of his last visit. It was the perfect place to set up camp. Gabriel let out a sigh of relief and began unpacking his equipment. As he set up the tent, a thought crossed his mind. The watchers mentioned the bears being more aggressive this time of year. He was fully aware of the risks, but determined to be cautious. Gabriel checked his belongings again, making sure he had everything he needed to protect himself. "Now yes, this is what I call camp," Gabriel said aloud, feeling the euphoria take over. He finished setting up the tent and began organizing the rest of the camp, preparing a small fire for cooking. "It will be all right," he said to himself, trying to shake off any trace of doubt. With the tent set up and the camp organized, he sat down to enjoy the view of the mountains in the distance. The sun was beginning to set, dyeing the sky orange and pink, creating a spectacle of color that was a balm to his city-weary soul. "This is life," Gabriel murmured, feeling peace begin to settle in. He prepared a light meal, using the portable kitchen utensils he had brought. As he ate, the sound of the night forest began to emerge, a soft chorus of nocturnal creatures. Gabriel felt more alive than he had in a long time, absorbing the serenity and beauty around him. However, he knew that he should be vigilant. When he finished his meal, he kept all the waste and made sure that nothing was exposed, so as not to attract animals. With one last look around, he entered the tent, carefully closing it. Lying in his sleeping bag, Gabriel felt the satisfaction of having overcome the obstacles to get there. The darkness of the night enveloped the camp, and he allowed himself to relax, listening to the soothing sounds of nature. Gabriel woke up almost in the morning, feeling excruciating pain all over his body. The cold of the morning penetrated his skin, intensifying the discomfort. He blinked several times, trying to understand where he was and what had happened. Slowly, memories of the bear attack began to return. The tent lay in tatters around him, deep claw marks tearing the fabric. Gabriel tried to move, but the pain was excruciating. Every movement was an agonizing effort, his muscles burning and his bones looking brittle. He looked at his wounds, dried blood staining his skin and clothes, and despair began to take over. "No, it can't be," he whispered, his voice hoarse and choked with pain. With a Herculean effort, Gabriel began to crawl out of the destroyed tent. Every inch he walked felt like an eternity, but he knew he needed to move. The cold was relentless, and he shivered violently, the shock and adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving only raw pain. Finally, he managed to reach his backpack, where his cell phone was. With trembling, bloody hands, he took it out and tried to call someone, anyone. But as he looked at the screen, his heart sank. There was no sign. "No, please don't," she murmured, feeling the hopelessness grow. Gabriel tried to get up, but his legs faltered, and he fell back to the ground, moaning in pain. She felt tears trickle down her face, mingling with dried blood and dirt. He was alone, wounded, and without communication. Nature, which once seemed so welcoming, now turned out to be ruthless and indifferent to his suffering. Trying to stay calm, Gabriel took a deep breath and looked around, trying to think of a plan. He needed to find a way out of there, or at least a safe place to wait for help. Perhaps, if he could move enough, he would find some higher point where he could get cell signal. "Come on, Gabriel. You can do it," he muttered to himself, trying to gather strength. With a renewed determination, he began to crawl again, ignoring the pain that ran through his body. He needed to survive. Every move was a struggle, but he forced himself to continue, one step at a time, toward the unknown. Dawn was beginning to dye the sky a pale blue, and Gabriel knew he needed to use the few hours of daylight to try to save himself. The challenge seemed insurmountable, but he could not give up. Their chances of survival depended on their ability to keep moving, to fight pain and despair, and to find a way to call for help. Gabriel, struggling with pain and cold, gathered all his strength to open the backpack. His movements were slow and shaky, but he knew he needed to be prepared for what came next. He took the pocket knife, a bottle of water, and some basic supplies that could help him survive. Looking around the clearing where he had set up his camp, everything seemed so distant and threatening now. With the pocket knife firmly in his hand and the water bottle strapped to his belt, Gabriel began to walk. Every step was torture, but he forced himself to continue. The uneven terrain of the forest, once welcoming, now looked like a cruel enemy, hindering their progress. As he walked, Gabriel's mind was filled with dark thoughts. How could I be so stubborn? If I had listened to the Watchers, none of this would be happening, he muttered to himself, his voice heavy with regret. The sun's rays began to break through the treetops, casting elongated shadows on the forest floor. The silence was broken only by the sound of his shuffling footsteps and heavy breathing. Gabriel stopped for a moment to rest, leaning against a tree. The pain was constant and the bleeding, though slower, still worrisome. He took out his water bottle and drank a few sips, trying to stay hydrated. The cold water was a temporary relief, but not enough to ease his situation. He looked around, trying to find some landmark or a path that would lead him back to civilization. "Come on, Gabriel. You need to continue," he told himself, closing his eyes for a moment and taking a deep breath. With renewed determination, he walked again. Even if each step seemed like an eternity, the trees all looked the same, and the feeling of being lost began to increase. Fatigue crept over him, but Gabriel knew he couldn't stop. I needed help. I needed to survive. As he walked, his memories of the bear attack came back in vivid flashes. The terror, the pain, the sound of claws tearing through the tent. He shuddered involuntarily, but tried to push these images out of his mind. I needed to focus on the present, on survival. "I'm going to get out of this," he said, trying to convince himself. "I need to get out of this." As he advanced, the forest seemed to close in around him, making the walk even more difficult. The dense trees blocked the sunlight, creating a gloomy and oppressive environment. Gabriel began to feel exhaustion take hold of his body, but he kept fighting, one step at a time. Finally, after what seemed like hours, he spotted a small hill ahead. Perhaps, if I could climb to the top, I could get cell phone signal or spot some road or trail that would lead to help. With one last burst of energy, Gabriel began to climb the hill. His movements were slow and painful, but he was determined. When he finally reached the top, he looked around, trying to find any sign of hope. The view provided a wider perspective of the forest, but it still seemed endless. He took his cell phone out of his pocket and looked at the screen, hoping to see some signal bar. To his frustration, there was still no sign. Gabriel felt the tears welling up, but quickly wiped them away. I couldn't give up now, not after everything I'd been through. I must continue, he said to himself, his voice a faint whisper. With the pocket knife in one hand and the cell phone in the other, Gabriel began to descend the hill, continuing his desperate search for survival and help. Every step was a struggle, but he refused to stop. He knew that somewhere ahead there was a chance for salvation, and he was determined to find it. Gabriel, exhausted and with his body throbbing with pain, finally gave in and sat down on the ground covered with leaves. He felt completely drained, physically and emotionally. He put his cell phone back in his pocket, frustrated by the lack of signal, but determined not to let it defeat him. I need to rest, just for a moment, he muttered to himself, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. After a few moments, he looked around and spotted a sturdy branch lying on the ground. With effort, he reached for it and used it to support himself as he stood up. The branch provided some support, relieving some of the pressure on his injured legs. He drank a few sips of water from the bottle, feeling the cold liquid slide down his throat, providing momentary relief. She took several deep breaths, trying to calm her nerves and her racing heart. Each step seemed more difficult than the last, and he realized that, due to extreme fatigue, he no longer knew the alternative route he had taken to enter the park. Despair was beginning to set in. He paused for a moment, trying to remember the path he had traveled the night before. But everything was a blur in his mind. The trees, the bushes, the uneven terrain. Everything looked the same now, without any clear reference. He looked around, feeling a wave of panic rise in his chest. I need to stay calm. I need to think clearly, he said, trying to encourage himself. Panicking won't help. With the branch in hand, Gabriel began to walk again. The extra support helped stabilize him, but the pain was a constant companion. Every step was a struggle, but he refused to give up. I knew I had to keep moving if I was going to have any chance of surviving. As he walked, his thoughts returned to what he had left behind. The city, your home, your daily routine. Everything seemed so far away now, as if it were part of another life. He thought of his friends and family, and the people who would miss him if he couldn't get out of that forest. I'm going to get out of here. I need to get out of here, he repeated to himself, using determination as fuel to keep going. The forest around him was silent, the sound of birds and insects creating a tranquil backdrop, in contrast to the storm of emotions within Gabriel. He knew he needed to find a way back to civilization, or at least a place where he could get help. After a time that seemed like an eternity, Gabriel spotted a small stream. Crystal clear water flowed smoothly over the stones, and he felt a spark of hope. Following the stream could lead you somewhere inhabited, or at least provide you with a constant source of water. He walked toward the creek, feeling a little more hopeful. He knelt on the bank and filled the bottle, drinking a little more and wetting his face to relieve fatigue. The cold water was invigorating, helping to clear his mind. I'm going to follow the course of the creek, he decided, feeling a bit of renewed energy. It must lead somewhere. With the firm branch in one hand and the bottle of water in the other, Gabriel began to follow the stream. Each step a battle, but each battle bringing him closer to a possible salvation. He felt alone, vulnerable and scared, but he knew he needed to keep going. For himself and for those who waited for him at home. After some time, he began to notice signs that the stream was becoming wider and deeper. The surrounding vegetation also changed, indicating that he was moving to a different area of the forest. This could be a good sign, meaning he was approaching a more open or inhabited area. Fatigue still weighed on him, and the pain of his injuries made every movement torture. But the hope of finding help or a way out fueled his will to continue. Every step, every effort, brought him closer to survival. Finally, after what seemed like hours of walking, Gabriel spotted something in the distance that made his heart race. It was a structure, perhaps a hut or a wooden shelter, hidden among the trees. He felt a surge of hope and picked up the pace, ignoring the pain coursing through his body. "Please let there be someone there," he muttered, quickening his pace. When he approached the hut, he saw that it was old and seemed to be abandoned. Still, it was a sign of civilization that someone had been there before. Carefully, he approached the door and opened it, hoping to find something that could help him. Inside, the hut was dark and dusty, but it provided shelter and perhaps some supplies. Gabriel entered, feeling the relief of being out of the cold and wind. He leaned against one of the walls and dropped to the floor, exhausted but hopeful. "I'm going to rest for a while, then I think about what to do," he said, closing his eyes for a moment. While resting, Gabriel tried to formulate a plan. He needed to find a way to get help, or at least to better orient himself. The hut could have something useful: food, clothes, maybe even a radio. He knew he needed to explore the place, but for now, all he could do was regain some of his strength and keep hope alive. During the night, Gabriel was awakened by a familiar and terrifying sound. The roar of a bear echoed through the forest, echoing off the walls of the hut. His heart raced and he woke up with a start, his eyes wide with dread. Sitting on the cold floor of the hut, he forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to calm the accelerated heartbeat. The bear's sound seemed to come from somewhere nearby, but he could not determine exactly from where. The darkness of the night only made the situation more terrifying. "No, not again," he muttered, his voice choked with fear. He quickly stood up, ignoring the pain coursing through his body, and searched around for anything he could use to defend himself. The hut was dimly lit, but the dim moonlight coming through the broken windows allowed him to see some scattered objects. He took the penknife, still stained with dried blood, and prepared for the worst. The bear's roar sounded again, closer this time. Gabriel felt cold sweat trickle down his forehead. The silence that followed was deafening, and he held his breath, trying to hear any sound that indicated the approach of the animal. The hut had only one door and a few small windows, all of which looked flimsy. He knew that if the bear decided to attack, those barriers would not be enough to stop him. "I needed to think of something quick." As the seconds ticked by, Gabriel began to slowly move around the hut, trying to be as quiet as possible. He approached the window overlooking the back of the structure and peered through a crack. Moonlight illuminated the forest, but he could see nothing but shadows and trees. The silence was broken again by a noise. Something was moving outside, heavy footsteps crushing dry leaves. Gabriel squeezed the penknife harder, his whole body tense. He knew he needed to make a quick decision. He couldn't sleep anymore. Fear and tension kept him alert, his eyes fixed on the darkness around him. Every sound made him shudder. The relief of having escaped the bear was palpable, but he knew he wasn't out of the woods yet. Dawn would bring better visibility and a chance to find a safe path. Over time, the night seemed to drag on, every minute an eternity. Gabriel tried to keep his mind occupied with thoughts of how he could escape from there as soon as daylight came. He mentally reviewed the supplies he still had in his backpack: water, some canned food, his pocket knife, and a partially used first aid kit. It was little, but it needed to be enough until I could find help. Finally, the first rays of the sun began to illuminate the horizon, painting the sky in orange and golden hues. Gabriel felt a slight relief as he saw the beginning of a new day. He stood up slowly, feeling every aching muscle protest. He looked around once more, making sure he was alone before he started to move. His plan was to follow the creek again. It was his best bet to find a trail or a landmark that would guide him back to civilization. It was still early, and he knew he needed to make the most of the daylight. Carefully, he began to walk beside the stream, keeping an eye out for any strange movement or sound. Every step was calculated, every look around an attempt to avoid any other unwanted encounter. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Gabriel felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. The pain of his injuries was constant, but he ignored it, focusing only on moving forward. The stream widened as it came down the mountainside, and Gabriel realized that he was moving towards a more open valley. The vision of a clearer path propelled him. He quickened his pace, concentrating on the goal of finding a way out of there. Every step was an advance toward the hope of being found, of being saved. Hours passed, but Gabriel did not give up. He knew he was closer to finding a way out. The creek became calmer as it approached the valley, its crystal-clear waters reflecting the morning sun. Finally, he spotted a hopeful sign ahead, a well-marked trail that crossed the creek. It was an indication that others had already passed by. He followed the trail, feeling the relief grow within him. With renewed determination, Gabriel continued to walk, knowing that he was on the right path to return to civilization. The journey wasn't over yet, but he felt the worst was over. Gabriel, walking along the trail, suddenly came across a bear coming towards him. The animal, imposing and curious, stood before him, sniffing the air curiously. Gabriel felt his heart race, fear threatening to overwhelm him. Instinctively, he remembered the advice to play dead in front of a bear. With slow, controlled movements, Gabriel lowered himself to the ground, lying on his back, his hands at his side, trying to control his breathing to look harmless. The bear approached, its large, wet snout sniffing Gabriel with interest. Gabriel's heart was pounding in his chest, every second feeling like an eternity. He forced himself not to blink, not to make any sudden movements that could provoke the animal. The bear continued to sniff him for a few moments that felt like hours. The bear, when sniffing Gabriel, did not show immediate aggression, but Gabriel knew that the situation was still dangerous. He tried to remain motionless, following the instinct to pretend to be dead in front of the animal. However, something went wrong. The bear, curious or perhaps annoyed by the human presence, began to drag Gabriel by the shirt into the forest. Gabriel desperately clung to the ground, feeling the fabric of his shirt tear under the bear's force. Fear and adrenaline overwhelmed him, struggling to stay calm as he was dragged through the bushes and trees. Every jolt from the bear sent waves of pain through his already sore wounds. As he was pulled, Gabriel tried to find something to hold on to, a root, a trunk, anything that could stop his advance. His hands searched frantically for something solid, but the uneven terrain of the forest made any attempt at resistance difficult. Gabriel's breathing was rapid and shallow, panic threatening to overwhelm him. He knew he needed to act fast or risk being taken deeper into the forest, where his chances of survival would be even lower. With one last desperate effort, Gabriel managed to free himself from the shirt that was being held by the bear. He rolled on the floor, moving away from the animal as quickly as possible. He ran as hard as he could, ignoring the pain in his bruised body, as the bear's distant roars echoed through the forest. Finally, Gabriel managed to hide behind a large rock, panting and trembling. He knew that he could not rest for long. The bear was still around, and he needed to find a way to escape before it was discovered again. Cautiously, Gabriel began to go around the rock, always keeping an eye on his surroundings. He needed to find a safe path back to the trail, or maybe somewhere he could hide until the bear moved away. The forest was silent now, except for the occasional crackle of branches under his feet and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Gabriel knew that his every move could betray his position. He forced himself to control his breathing, fighting the growing fear that threatened to paralyze him. As he moved cautiously through the dense vegetation, Gabriel quickly thought about his options. He needed to find safety and an escape route. The thought of being caught again by the bear filled him with terror. Desperate at the proximity of the bear and his own precarious situation, Gabriel set out in search of the trail he had previously seen. Every step was a mixture of intense pain and pure survival instinct. His muscles screamed with exhaustion, but he ignored the pain, focusing only on moving forward. Finally, among the dense bushes, he spotted a mark on the earth, a sign that he was close to the trail. With a sigh of relief mixed with growing despair, Gabriel launched himself in the direction of the trail, running with as much energy as he had left. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, tinting the sky with shades of orange and red. Gabriel knew he didn't have long before darkness fell over the forest, making his situation even more dangerous. He needed to find a safe place before it was too late. Every breath seemed to draw a little more energy from him. At every step, he desperately hoped to hear the noise of a vehicle or see signs of civilization beyond the trees. But the forest remained silent except for the sound of his own hurried footsteps. The trail wound through the trees, sometimes disappearing under dense vegetation, other times clearly marked by the trampled path. Gabriel struggled not to fall, his feet and legs burning with fatigue. Every time he thought of giving up, the thought of the bear propelled him forward. Time seemed to stretch, every minute dragging on as he made his way along the trail. Daylight dwindled rapidly, leaving him with only the hope of finding a safe haven before night fell. Night enveloped the forest in its dense, silent darkness. Gabriel, exhausted and desperate, remained on the trail, aware that his chances of survival were diminishing with each passing moment. His thoughts oscillated between fear of the bear and the fragile hope of finding help before it was too late. Suddenly, in the distance, Gabriel spotted some lights approaching between the trees. His heart raced with a mixture of hope and fear. He thought of running away, afraid of being discovered by something even more dangerous in the darkness of the forest. But as the lights got closer, he realized they were park rangers. A relief mixed with gratitude overwhelmed him when the rangers finally got close enough to identify him. They descended from their vehicles with lanterns, illuminating the surrounding darkness as they cautiously approached Gabriel. "Are you all right? What happened here?" one of the guards asked worriedly, noting Gabriel's frayed state. Gabriel took a deep breath, trying to articulate the words between tiredness and relief. "I was attacked by a bear. I got lost. I tried to find the trail back." His voice came out in a hoarse whisper. The guards helped him to his feet, offering him water and immediate assistance. They explained that they were patrolling the area due to recent reports of unusual bear activity in the region, which explained their presence that night. "We will take him to get medical attention immediately," one of the guards said, guiding Gabriel toward the vehicles. Gabriel felt a mixture of gratitude and disbelief as he was led out of the forest. He looked back one last time, remembering the darkness and danger he had faced only moments before. Help had arrived in time, and he wondered how he could have survived that hostile night alone. As the rangers led him to safety, Gabriel closed his eyes, silently thanking them for being found in time. The experience would leave deep marks, but he was alive, and for now that was all that mattered. Gabriel felt a mixture of relief and gratitude as the rangers led him out of the dangerous area of the forest. Despite the fine he knew he would have to pay, he was deeply grateful to have escaped that deadly encounter with the bear alive. As the ranger vehicles drove him back to civilization, Gabriel couldn't help but reflect on how much worse the situation could have been. He remembered the harrowing hours he spent lost in the dark forest, fighting pain and fear, not knowing if he would be able to survive until dawn. Arriving at the ranger station, Gabriel was met by a medical team that promptly attended to him. His injuries, though serious, were not life-threatening, but he would need care and observation for a few days. While being examined and treated, Gabriel thought about what he had learned from this experience. The adventure that began with the excitement of a lonely camp in the mountains had turned into a struggle for survival. He promised himself that he would never again underestimate the dangers of wilderness. Over the next few days, Gabriel received regular visits from the rangers who found him, all expressing relief that they had rescued him in time. The fine for violating park rules hurt in his pockets, but he knew it was a small price to pay compared to his life. Once he was medically discharged, Gabriel returned to his daily routine in the city, but now with a new appreciation for the safety and comfort of urban life. He shared his story with friends and family, using it as a reminder of how beautiful nature can be and at the same time unforgiving. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.